The winter of 1928 was unforgiving in Harlem. Snow fell like ash over broken sidewalks where children played with sticks and stones because toys were luxuries their parents couldn't afford. Inside a cramped apartment on West 140th Street, a woman stood at a stove that had gone cold hours ago. There was no coal left to burn, no wood to feed the flames, just the hollow silence of empty cupboards and the kind of hunger that makes your stomach forget what fullness feels like. Her children sat at a table made from a wooden crate, their eyes following her movements with the quiet desperation of those too young to understand poverty, but old enough to feel its teeth. The oldest boy, barely 7 years old, watched his mother's hands tremble as she searched through jars that had nothing left to give. His name was Ellsworth. The streets would later know him as Bumpy Johnson. And on that frozen night, with his belly empty and his mother's tears falling into her apron, something inside that boy turned to stone. Harlem in the late 1920s was a contradiction wrapped in jazz music and desperation. It was the heart of the Renaissance, where black artists and intellectuals were rewriting what it meant to be American, where the Cotton Club blazed with trumpets and the Apollo Theater made stars out of dreamers. But behind the music and the poetry, behind the speakeasies and the rent parties, there existed another Harlem, a Harlem where families like the Johnsons lived in tenements with walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's prayers, where bathrooms were shared by entire floors and rats were as common as hope was rare, where a man could work 16 hours in a factory and still come home to children who hadn't eaten. This was the Harlem that didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating Negro culture. This was the Harlem where survival wasn't about art. It was about doing whatever it took to see tomorrow. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had been born in Charleston, South Carolina, in October of 1905, but his family had joined the Great Migration north when he was still young enough to forget the taste of Southern air. They came to New York like tens of thousands of other black families, believing the promise that the North was different, that opportunity waited behind every factory door and every street corner. What they found instead was a different kind of cage. The jobs paid barely enough to cover rent. The landlords were vultures who charged black families double what white families paid for half the space. The police treated Harlem like occupied territory, and the Italian and Irish gangs that controlled the numbers rackets and the bootlegging operations made it clear that certain kinds of money were off limits to black hands. The Johnsons had arrived with hope and watched it die slow, meal by missed meal, until that winter night when there was nothing left in the house to eat and nowhere left to turn. The boy's father had disappeared months earlier. Some said he'd gone back south. Others whispered he'd gotten himself killed over a gambling debt, or a woman, or both. The truth didn't matter much to a family that was starving. Ellsworth's mother, Margaret, had tried everything. She'd cleaned houses for white families downtown, scrubbing floors until her knees bled and her hands cracked open in the cold. She'd taken in laundry, washing other people's clothes in water so cold it felt like punishment. She'd begged at church and borrowed from neighbors who had nothing to lend. But Harlem in 1928 was drowning, and nobody had lifeboats to spare. The Depression hadn't officially started yet, but in neighborhoods like this, the Depression had been going on since the day the first family arrived. Hunger wasn't new. It was generational. Young Ellsworth learned early that the world didn't care about fairness. He watched his mother's dignity crack piece by piece as she stood in charity lines that stretched around entire blocks. He saw the way the social workers looked at her, like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock, like poverty was a moral failing instead of a system designed to keep certain people in certain places. He felt the shame burning in his chest when teachers at school asked why he wore the same clothes every day, why he smelled like old sweat and desperation. But more than shame, the boy felt rage, a cold, calculating rage that didn't explode in tantrums but settled deep in his bones and waited. He started watching the men on the corners, the ones who wore good shoes and carried rolls of cash thick enough to choke on, the ones who never seemed to worry about where their next meal was coming from. There was a code on those streets that nobody wrote down, but everyone understood. If you were smart and ruthless and willing to cross lines that other men drew in the sand, you could eat. You could survive. You might even thrive. But it required leaving behind whatever the church had taught you about righteousness and good behavior. It required looking at the law not as something sacred, but as something that was designed to protect people who already had everything and punish people who were trying to get something. Ellsworth watched and learned. He saw how the numbers runners operated, collecting bets from every doorway and delivering slips of paper that represented hope to people who had nothing else to hope for. He saw how the bootleggers moved crates of illegal whiskey through the streets in broad daylight because they'd paid the right cops to look the other way. He saw how respect wasn't given to men who worked honest jobs and struggled to feed their families. Respect went to men who took what they wanted and made others fear the consequences of getting in their way. By the time Ellsworth was 12, he'd already been arrested twice. Once for stealing food from a market, once for rolling a drunk who'd stumbled out of a speakeasy with pockets full of cash. The police beat him both times, leaving bruises that turned purple and yellow across his ribs and back. They called him animal. They called him thug. They told him he'd end up dead or in prison by the time he was 20, and they said it like they were looking forward to it. But the beatings didn't scare him straight. They did the opposite. They confirmed what he'd already suspected, that the world was divided into people who had power and people who didn't, that everything else was just decoration, that if he wanted to make sure his family never went hungry again, he couldn't play by rules that were rigged against him from birth. He had to become the kind of man that other men feared, the kind of man who took what he needed and made the world bend to his will instead of the other way around. His nickname came from a deformity on the back of his head, a large bump that other kids had mocked when he was younger. Bumpy. They'd said it to hurt him, but he wore it like armor. Let them remember the name. Let them associate it with someone who didn't back down, who didn't flinch, who hit back twice as hard as he'd been hit. By his teenage years, Bumpy Johnson had developed a reputation in Harlem as someone you didn't cross. He was smart enough to know when to fight and when to talk. He was loyal to the few people he considered family, and he was ruthless to everyone else. He worked as a bodyguard for numbers runners. He collected debts for loan sharks who operated out of storefront churches. He learned how to move through the underworld like it was his natural habitat, which it was, because he'd been born into poverty and violence, and the only way out was through. But working for other men had limits. Bumpy saw how the real money flowed up the chain to bosses who sat in comfortable apartments and never got their hands dirty. He watched Italian mobsters from downtown come into Harlem and take cuts from every illegal operation, taxing black criminals like they were running a government. He saw how the mafia had divided up New York into territories and how Harlem was treated like a colony, valuable for its numbers racket and its nightclubs, but never allowed to govern itself. The white gangs got rich while black operators scrambled for scraps. And Bumpy Johnson decided that wouldn't be his story. He wouldn't spend his life making other men wealthy while his people stayed poor. He would build something that belonged to him, something that couldn't be taken away by men who thought their skin color gave them ownership over everything. The 1930s brought the full weight of the Great Depression crashing down on America, and Harlem suffered worse than almost anywhere else. Unemployment hit 70% in some blocks. Families were evicted into the streets with nowhere to go. Soup kitchens ran out of soup. The desperation that had always simmered beneath the surface of Harlem boiled over into riots and rage. But for men like Bumpy Johnson, the Depression created opportunities. When legal money disappeared, illegal money became the only money. The numbers racket exploded as people bet their last pennies on 3-digit combinations, hoping for a miracle payout. Bootlegging continued despite or maybe because of prohibition, and the men who controlled these operations became more powerful than any politician or preacher. They were the ones who decided who ate and who starved, who lived and who got buried in unmarked graves in potter's fields outside the city. Bumpy rose through the ranks by being smarter and more strategic than the men around him. He didn't drink or gamble, which made him rare in a world where most criminals destroyed themselves with their own vices. He read books on military strategy and history, studying how empires were built and how power was consolidated. He understood that respect came not just from violence, but from calculation, from knowing when to show mercy and when to demonstrate what happened to people who mistook that mercy for weakness. He built a crew of loyal men who followed him, not because they feared him, though they did, but because he made sure they were taken care of. He paid well. He protected their families. He never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. And slowly, block by block, operation by operation, Bumpy Johnson carved out territory in Harlem that belonged to him. But Harlem in the 30s and 40s was still controlled largely by downtown mobsters. The Italian mafia had their hands in everything, and they made it clear that black criminals were allowed to operate only because white criminals permitted it. The most powerful of these downtown bosses was a man named Charles Lucky Luciano, who'd helped modernize the mafia and turn it into a corporate enterprise. Luciano and his associates collected tribute from every major operation in Harlem, taxing the numbers, banks, and the heroin trade and the protection rackets. They installed white overseers to make sure the money flowed in the right direction. And they used violence to remind anyone who forgot their place exactly where the power really lived. For years, Bumpy Johnson paid his dues to these men, biding his time, learning their systems, waiting for the moment when he could flip the table. That moment came in the mid-1940s when the federal government started cracking down on organized crime with a focus that had been missing during Prohibition. Lucky Luciano got deported to Italy. Other major mafia figures went to prison or got killed in internal power struggles. The carefully constructed hierarchies that had governed the underworld started to fracture. And in Harlem, there was suddenly a vacuum. The Italian bosses still had influence, but their grip had loosened. The question became who would step into that vacuum, who had the intelligence, the ruthlessness, and the respect to take control of Harlem's underworld and keep it. Bumpy Johnson believed he was that man, but he wasn't the only one with ambitions. There were other black gangsters who wanted the crown. There were still Italian crews who refused to cede control. And there was a new generation of young criminals who didn't care about the old rules or the old hierarchies. The late 40s in Harlem became a war zone. Not the kind of war that made newspaper headlines, but a shadow war fought in alleys and tenement hallways and after-hours clubs. Bodies turned up in the Harlem River with their throats cut or bullets in the back of their heads. Banks got robbed and burned. Witnesses disappeared before they could talk to police who mostly didn't care anyway. Bumpy Johnson moved through this chaos like a general directing troops, making alliances with some crews and wiping out others. He wasn't the biggest or the most violent, but he was the smartest. He understood that power in Harlem couldn't just be taken by force. It had to be earned by providing something the community needed. So while he ran illegal operations, he also made sure those operations benefited Harlem itself. He paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them. He gave money to churches and schools. He protected local businesses from other criminals. He became a contradiction that Harlem understood even if the outside world never would. A criminal and a hero. By 1950, Bumpy Johnson had consolidated control over much of Harlem's underworld. He'd formed an alliance with the remnants of the Italian mafia, negotiating deals that gave him autonomy in Harlem while still paying tribute for peace. He'd eliminated or absorbed his black rivals. He'd built a network of legitimate businesses that laundered money and provided cover for his illegal enterprises. He owned nightclubs and restaurants. He had judges and police captains on his payroll. He moved through Harlem like royalty, dressed in tailored suits, riding in Cadillacs, shaking hands with ministers and congressmen who publicly condemned crime while privately taking his donations. He'd gone from that starving boy at an empty table to one of the most powerful black men in New York. But power had costs that compounded over time. He'd been to prison 3 times by then. serving sentences for assault and drug charges and racketeering. Each time he went away, rivals tried to take what was his. Each time he came back out, he had to rebuild and remind people why they'd feared him in the first place. The violence never stopped. The paranoia never eased. He trusted almost no one completely because betrayal was currency in the underworld and loyalty could be purchased by whoever offered the highest bid. He'd lost friends to bullets and prison cells. He'd ordered deaths that sometimes kept him awake at night even though he'd never admit it. The empire he'd built required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant willingness to do things that would make ordinary men recoil. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't an ordinary man. He'd been forged in hunger and humiliation, and he'd decided long ago that he'd rather die powerful than live powerless. The 1950s brought new challenges as the drug trade began to eclipse the numbers racket in profitability. Heroin flooded into Harlem from European connections, poisoning the same community Bumpy claimed to protect. This created a moral complexity that he navigated with the kind of cold pragmatism that separated successful criminals from dead ones. He didn't use drugs himself and hated what they did to people. But he also understood that if he didn't control the heroin trade in Harlem, someone else would. Someone who wouldn't care about the community at all. Someone who'd turn Harlem into a graveyard in pursuit of profit. So Bumpy got into the drug business, but he set rules. No selling to children. No cutting the product with poison that killed users faster. No allowing the trade to destroy entire blocks the way it was destroying other neighborhoods. These rules didn't make him noble. They just made him slightly less monstrous than the alternative. During this era, Bumpy formed connections with other major black crime figures across the country, including Frank Matthews in Philadelphia and Nicky Barnes in New York. These men recognized that the future of black organized crime required thinking bigger than neighborhood territories. It required building nationwide networks that could compete with the mafia on equal terms. They started meeting in secret, usually in places far from their home cities, discussing how to pool resources and create supply chains that didn't depend on Italian or Jewish middlemen. These meetings were dangerous. If the wrong people found out, it could spark wars that would consume entire cities. But they were also necessary, because the only way to truly control your own destiny in the underworld was to control every step from importation to street-level distribution. Bumpy's influence extended beyond crime. He became a political force in Harlem, though he never ran for office or held any official position. Politicians who wanted to win elections in Harlem came to him for endorsements and organizational support. He controlled enough votes through his network of employees and associates to swing close races. He used this leverage to push for things the community needed: better housing, more jobs, police reforms, better schools. He worked behind the scenes with civil rights leaders, some of whom publicly condemned him while privately accepting his money and muscle when they needed protection from racist violence. This dual existence, as both gangster and community benefactor, made him a complicated figure. To some, he was a hero who stood up for black people when nobody else would. To others, he was a poison who profited from his community's suffering. The truth was probably that he was both. In 1952, Bumpy Johnson walked into a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan for a meeting that would define the next chapter of his life. The restaurant was one of those places where politicians and mobsters and businessmen all mixed together because at a certain level of power, the distinctions between those categories became meaningless. He was there to meet with representatives of the Genovese crime family, one of the 5 major mafia organizations that controlled New York. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries after months of negotiation. The subject was simple but explosive. The Genovese family wanted to renegotiate the terms of their arrangement with Bumpy. They wanted a larger percentage of the profits from Harlem's numbers racket and heroin trade. They wanted more control over who could operate and who couldn't. They wanted to remind Bumpy that despite his power in Harlem, he was still ultimately beholden to them. Bumpy Johnson sat across from two men who looked like accountants but were actually enforcers responsible for dozens of murders between them. They laid out their demands in calm voices, as if they were discussing a business transaction instead of a power play that could spark a war. They reminded him that the Genovese family had connections he didn't have, that they could make problems with law enforcement disappear or multiply depending on how cooperative he was, that Harlem existed within a larger ecosystem, and it would be a shame if that ecosystem turned hostile. They didn't threaten him directly. They didn't need to. The threat was implied in every word, in the way they smiled without warmth, in the fact that this meeting was happening at all. They expected him to agree, to nod his head and accept the new terms, because that's what black criminals had always done when white criminals demanded more. But Bumpy Johnson didn't agree. He sat there in his perfectly tailored suit smoking a cigarette, and he told them no. He explained in a voice that never rose above conversational volume that Harlem had changed, that the old arrangements made sense when he was weaker and they were stronger. But the balance had shifted. He had his own supply lines now, his own political connections, his own muscle. He'd been paying them for protection he no longer needed. So the new arrangement would be different. He'd continue to pay them a percentage, but it would be smaller, and it would be paid as a gesture of respect between equals, not as tribute from a vassal to a lord. The two men across from him stopped smiling. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. One of them leaned forward and asked if Bumpy understood what he was risking, if he knew how many men they could put on the streets if this went bad, if he was really willing to die over percentages and pride. Bumpy took a long drag from his cigarette and met their eyes without blinking. He said he understood perfectly, that he'd been willing to die since he was a child watching his mother cry over an empty pot. That fear was a tool that worked on men who had something to lose, but he'd grown up with nothing and built everything he had by taking risks that more cautious men avoided. He said that if they wanted war, he'd give them war. And maybe they'd win, maybe they'd kill him and burn Harlem to the ground in the process, but it would cost them more than they'd ever collect in tribute. It would cost them in blood and money and reputation, because Harlem wouldn't go down quiet, and every cop and politician and newspaper in New York would be watching what happened when the mafia tried to destroy a black neighborhood over greed, so they could accept his offer, or they could roll the dice. But either way, he wasn't backing down. The meeting ended without violence, but without resolution. Bumpy walked out of that restaurant not knowing if he'd be alive by the end of the week. He'd called the bluff of men who rarely bluffed. He'd challenged an organization that had toppled governments and corrupted entire police departments. But he'd also made a calculation that his life was worth less than his dignity, that living on his knees was worse than dying on his feet. And maybe more importantly, he'd gambled that the mafia would recognize the truth in his argument, that a war with Harlem would be expensive and bloody and attract attention nobody wanted, that taking a smaller percentage of a growing operation was smarter than trying to seize everything and ending up with nothing but corpses and federal investigations. For 3 weeks, Harlem held its breath. Everyone in the underworld knew that something had shifted. Crews prepared for war. Weapons were stockpiled. Alliances were confirmed or dissolved. The police noticed the tension and increased patrols, not to stop the violence, but to make sure it stayed contained to the neighborhoods where the city didn't care if bodies piled up. Bumpy moved through this pressure like a man who'd already accepted death, which made him more dangerous than he'd ever been. He didn't hide. He went to the same restaurants and clubs he always visited. He dared them to come for him in public where the whole community would see. And he made sure every newspaper in Black America knew that if something happened to him, it would be because downtown mobsters couldn't accept a black man demanding equal treatment. The breakthrough came through an unexpected channel. An old Italian capo who'd worked with Bumpy during the 40s reached out through back channels. This man had respect in the mafia, but also understood that times were changing. He'd seen what was happening in the South with the civil rights movement. He'd read the demographic reports showing that black populations in northern cities were growing while white populations fled to suburbs. He understood that Harlem's economy was only going to become more valuable and that trying to control it through force and intimidation was a losing strategy. So he became a mediator. He convinced the Genovese leadership that Bumpy's proposal wasn't weakness, it was the future, that letting him operate with more autonomy would actually stabilize Harlem and make everyone more money, that the world was changing and the mafia could either adapt or get left behind. The final agreement was negotiated in a series of meetings that took place in the back rooms of restaurants and social clubs across Manhattan. Lawyers were involved, though nothing was ever written down. Accountants were brought in to calculate percentages and revenue projections. And eventually, a deal was reached. Bumpy Johnson would maintain control over Harlem's underworld operations. He'd pay the Genovese family a percentage of profits, but it would be significantly smaller than what they'd demanded. In exchange, he'd have their protection if other crime families tried to move into his territory. He'd have access to their political connections when he needed favors from judges or police commanders. And most importantly, he'd be recognized as a boss, not a subordinate, not a lieutenant who took orders, but a boss who ran his own organization and sat at tables where decisions were made instead of simply being told what those decisions were. The deal was signed not with documents, but with a dinner. A formal dinner at an Italian restaurant in Little Italy, where Bumpy Johnson sat at a table with bosses from multiple crime families. The symbolism was clear to everyone who knew how the underworld worked. A black man sitting as an equal among the most powerful criminals in New York. A black man whose word carried the same weight as theirs. A black man who'd come from nothing and built an empire that even the mafia had to acknowledge. They ate and drank and talked about business with the casual tone of executives discussing quarterly earnings. They laughed at jokes and shared stories about close calls and old enemies. And when the dinner ended, Bumpy Johnson walked out knowing he'd achieved something almost impossible. He'd forced the American mafia to treat him as a peer. News of the deal spread through the criminal underworld like electricity. Black gangsters across the country looked at what Bumpy had accomplished and saw possibility. If he could negotiate with the mafia as an equal, then maybe others could too. Maybe the future didn't have to be about begging for scraps from downtown bosses. Maybe black organized crime could build its own structures, its own networks, its own empires. The deal didn't end racism in the underworld. It didn't suddenly make everyone equal, but it cracked open a door that had been locked for generations. And men like Frank Matthews and Nicky Barnes and later Leroy Barnes would walk through that door and build operations that rivaled anything the mafia had created. But the deal also made Bumpy Johnson a target in new ways. There were old guard mafia members who hated that he'd been given respect, who saw it as a betrayal of the racial hierarchies that had always governed organized crime. These men started looking for ways to undermine him, to create problems that would force the Genovese leadership to reconsider their agreement. At the same time, there were younger black criminals who resented that Bumpy had negotiated with the mafia at all, who saw any cooperation with white gangsters as selling out, who wanted to go to war and take everything by force instead of negotiation. Bumpy found himself navigating between these factions, trying to maintain the peace he'd worked so hard to create, while also proving he was still strong enough to destroy anyone who tested him. The 1950s became Bumpy Johnson's golden era. He was at the height of his power and wealth. He moved between the criminal world and the legitimate world with an ease that few could match. He was friends with celebrities and athletes who'd grown up in Harlem and remembered when he'd helped their families during hard times. He was photographed at championship boxing matches and movie premieres. He drove custom Cadillacs and wore suits that cost more than most people's annual rent. He owned apartment buildings and nightclubs and restaurants. He employed hundreds of people directly and influenced the employment of thousands more through businesses that depended on his protection or patronage. He was, by any measure, one of the richest and most powerful black men in New York. And every dollar of that wealth, every ounce of that power, was built on the foundation of the deal he'd made, the deal that said he was nobody's servant anymore. But wealth and power in the criminal world are never permanent. They're temporary holdings that require constant defense. And by the late 50s, Bumpy was facing challenges that even his intelligence and ruthlessness couldn't fully control. The federal government had created the Bureau of Narcotics and was targeting major drug traffickers with a focus and resources that hadn't existed before. They wanted high-profile arrests. They wanted to prove that no criminal was untouchable. And Bumpy Johnson, with his public profile and his expensive lifestyle and his refusal to hide, was an obvious target. The FBI opened files on him that grew thicker by the month. They photographed him. They tapped his phones. They turned his associates into informants by threatening them with decades in prison. In 1960, Bumpy was arrested on federal drug charges. The evidence against him was substantial. Testimony from former associates who'd been flipped by federal agents. Surveillance photos showing him meeting with known drug dealers. Financial records that traced money from heroin sales back to businesses he controlled. His lawyers fought hard, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that he was being targeted because he was black and successful and refused to know his place. But the jury didn't care about racial politics. They cared about the witnesses who testified that Bumpy Johnson had run one of the largest drug operations in Harlem for years. They cared about the dead bodies that littered his rise to power. They cared about the neighborhoods that had been destroyed by the heroin he'd allowed to flood the streets. Bumpy Johnson was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was 54 years old. The empire he'd built began to fracture the moment he was taken away. The men he'd trusted started fighting among themselves over who would lead in his absence. The mafia saw opportunity and started reasserting control over operations they'd ceded. Younger criminals who didn't remember the wars of the 40s and 50s started taking territory by force. Harlem descended into chaos. The murder rates spiked. The drug trade became more vicious and unregulated. Everything Bumpy had built, all the stability he'd tried to maintain, collapsed like a house of cards the moment the architect was removed. He spent the early 1960s in various federal prisons, watching his empire dissolve through letters and prison visitors who brought him news he didn't want to hear. He tried to maintain control from behind bars, sending orders through trusted intermediaries. But prison walls are barriers to power. His orders were ignored or misunderstood. His attempts to mediate disputes failed because the men fighting had never feared him personally. They'd only feared his reputation, and reputations decay quickly when the man behind them can't enforce consequences. Bumpy's time in prison was frustrating in ways that violence and poverty had never been. Because violence and poverty were enemies he could fight. Prison was just time. Empty, wasted time that stole his relevance piece by piece. He was released in 1963 after his lawyers successfully appealed parts of his conviction. He walked out of prison expecting to reclaim what had been taken. What he found instead was a Harlem that had moved on without him. The civil rights movement had reached its peak. Malcolm X was preaching at mosques about black pride and self-determination. Martin Luther King was leading marches and sit-ins. Young people were talking about revolution and justice and ending oppression. And here was Bumpy Johnson, a relic from a different era, trying to rebuild a criminal empire in a community that was starting to ask whether criminal empires were part of the problem. He was only 57, but he looked older. Prison had aged him, and the city had aged past him. He tried to reassemble his organization. He reached out to old associates and discovered that some had been killed, some had retired, some had switched allegiances to younger bosses. He tried to reopen his supply chains and found that the drug trade had evolved into something more corporate and more vicious than what he remembered. He tried to negotiate with the mafia and discovered that the men he'd made deals with were dead or in prison themselves, and the new generation didn't feel bound by old agreements. For the first time in decades, Bumpy Johnson felt powerless, not because he'd been defeated in battle, but because the world had changed while he was locked away, and he wasn't sure how to change with it. But Bumpy was nothing if not adaptable. He'd survived poverty and prison and assassination attempts. He'd built an empire from nothing once. He could do it again. He started smaller this time, more careful. He used what remained of his reputation to carve out a piece of Harlem's drug trade. He made alliances with younger criminals who respected the legend even if they hadn't lived through the reality. He invested his remaining money in legitimate businesses that could generate income without attracting federal attention. He became more of an advisor than an operator, the gray eminence who younger bosses came to for counsel, the elder statesman of Harlem's underworld who commanded respect through wisdom instead of violence. Through the mid and late 60s, Bumpy rebuilt a smaller but more sustainable version of his empire. He was never as powerful as he'd been before prison, never as wealthy, never as feared. But he was respected, and in the world he inhabited, respect was its own form of currency. He watched Harlem change around him, watched the riots of '64 and '65 tear the neighborhood apart, watched the heroin epidemic devastate families and turn vibrant blocks into ghost towns, watched the civil rights movement achieve legal victories that somehow didn't translate into economic improvement for the people he'd grown up with. And he wondered if any of it mattered, if all the violence and sacrifice and empire building had made any real difference, or if he'd just been another man trying to survive in a system designed to ensure he couldn't. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson suffered a heart attack while eating breakfast at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He collapsed at the table and was pronounced dead before the ambulance arrived. He was 62 years old. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, criminals and ministers, politicians and police officers, the famous and the forgotten, people whose lives he'd saved and people whose relatives he'd killed. It was the kind of funeral that only complicated men receive, where mourners aren't sure if they're celebrating a life or acknowledging the end of something that should have ended decades earlier. The newspapers called him a gangster and a racketeer, but in Harlem, people called him Bumpy. And they remembered him not for the violence or the drugs, but for the fact that he'd been one of them, poor and black and angry at a world that had tried to make him nothing, and he'd refused. 20 years after that hungry winter night, when young Ellsworth Johnson watched his mother weep over an empty stove, he'd become one of the richest and most powerful black men in New York. He'd negotiated with the mafia as an equal. He'd built an empire that employed thousands and generated millions. He'd proven that a black man could rise as high in the underworld as any white gangster, that respect and power weren't determined by skin color, but by intelligence and will and ruthlessness. But the question that haunted his story, the question that haunts all stories like his, was whether any of it mattered, whether wealth built on suffering was worth having, whether power that required constant violence was actually power at all, whether a man who feeds his own family by flooding his community with poison can really be called successful. The truth is that Bumpy Johnson was both hero and villain, savior and destroyer, a man who protected his community and profited from its pain, a man who stood up to racist power structures while building his own oppressive hierarchy, a man who started from nothing and achieved everything, but at costs that compounded across generations. The families helped by his charity had to be weighed against the families destroyed by his drug trade. The dignity he claimed for himself and for black organized crime had to be weighed against the indignity of children who grew up with addicted parents. The empire he built had to be weighed against the lives destroyed to build it. There's no simple moral to his story, no clean lesson, just the complicated reality of a complicated man living in complicated times. After his death, the remains of his organization dissolved completely. The younger bosses who'd worked for him or with him went their own ways, starting operations that would rise and fall over the next decades. Some became more successful than Bumpy ever was. Frank Matthews built a drug empire worth hundreds of millions before disappearing with $15 million in cash and never being found. Nicky Barnes became a celebrity criminal whose face appeared on the cover of the New York Times Magazine above the headline, "Mr. Untouchable." but none of them ever quite captured what Bumpy Johnson represented. None of them carried that same weight of history and struggle and transformation. The deal Bumpy negotiated with the Mafia in the 1950s wasn't just about money or territory. It was about recognition, about forcing an institution built on exclusion to acknowledge that black criminals could be just as smart, just as ruthless, just as successful as white criminals. That sounds like a strange thing to take pride in. Criminal equality. But in America in the 1950s, when black people couldn't eat at the same lunch counters as white people, when they couldn't vote in much of the country, when they were openly treated as inferior in every legal and social institution, having a black gangster sit at the table with mafia bosses and negotiate as an equal meant something. It was a crack in the wall of white supremacy, a tiny fissure that suggested the whole structure might someday crumble. But the costs of that recognition were borne by people who never had a choice. The children who grew up in apartments Bumpy owned, watching their parents nod off from heroin he'd allowed into their neighborhood. The mothers who buried sons killed in the power struggles he orchestrated. The fathers who spent decades in prison for crimes committed in his organization. The whole community of Harlem, which provided the foundation and the justification for his empire, but also suffered most from its existence. They paid the price for his recognition. They funded his wealth with their poverty. They enabled his power with their vulnerability. And when he died, they were left with neighborhoods poisoned by the same drug trade he'd controlled and profited from. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson is the legacy of American crime itself, of people pushed to the margins and forced to create their own economies, legal or otherwise, of communities destroyed by the systems that were supposed to serve them, turning to criminals who at least pretended to care, of the false choice between empty righteousness and profitable corruption, of the way poverty and racism create conditions where crime becomes not just tempting, but rational, of the complicated truth that sometimes the villain feeding your family looks more like a hero than the system starving you looks like justice. Bumpy's story doesn't offer easy answers. It just offers a mirror. And what we see in that mirror depends on where we're standing and what we're willing to admit about the world that created him. His mother, Margaret Johnson, lived long enough to see her son become exactly what she'd feared he would become, and also exactly what she'd needed him to be. She never went hungry again after Bumpy started making real money. She lived in a nice apartment that he paid for. She wore nice clothes that he bought. She had respect in the community because she was his mother, but she also knew what he did. She knew the bodies. She knew the drugs. She knew the darkness required to build the light he'd wrapped her in. And according to people who knew her, she carried that knowledge like a weight that never got lighter. The love and the shame existing in her simultaneously, irreconcilable, permanent. That same contradiction existed in Harlem's relationship with Bumpy. The neighborhood knew he was a criminal, but he was their criminal. He'd grown up hungry in the same tenements they lived in. He understood their struggles because they were his struggles. He'd fought the same enemies they fought even if his methods were different. So when he walked through the streets, people showed respect. When he died, they mourned. Not because they approved of everything he'd done, but because he'd represented a kind of strength and defiance that felt important in a world that constantly tried to make them feel weak and compliant. He'd refused to bow. He'd demanded respect from people who thought they didn't have to give it. He'd become rich and powerful in a system designed to keep him poor and powerless. And if the methods were ugly, well, the system that created the need for those methods was uglier. The apartment on West 140th Street where young Ellsworth had sat at an empty table still stands today. It's been renovated and re-renovated. Different families have lived there. Different children have sat at different tables. But the building remembers in the way that buildings do, in the worn stairs and the thin walls and the persistent sense that struggle is written into the architecture itself. That apartment represents the starting point, the zero from which everything else was measured. The night when hunger and humiliation combined to create something cold and determined in a 7-year-old boy's heart. Everything that came after, all the violence and empire and legend, grew from that seed planted on that frozen night. Bumpy Johnson's story asks uncomfortable questions about what success means, about whether economic mobility justifies any method, about whether individual triumph matters when it's built on collective suffering, about whether a man who starts from poverty and becomes wealthy through crime is a success story or a tragedy. American culture loves rags to riches narratives. We celebrate people who overcome obstacles and build empires. But we get uncomfortable when those empires are built outside legal boundaries, when the wealth comes from drugs instead of tech startups, when the obstacles overcome include not just poverty, but also the basic morality that says you shouldn't poison your own community. Bumpy Johnson's success was real, his wealth was real, his power was real, but so was the destruction, so was the suffering. So was the multi-generational trauma his drug trade helped create. 20 years separated the hungry child from the wealthy boss. 2 decades of transformation that required leaving behind almost everything except survival instinct and strategic intelligence. The boy who'd sat at an empty table became the man who hosted dinners for mafia bosses. The child whose mother had wept over her inability to feed her family became the adult who made sure his mother never wanted for anything. The transformation was complete, and it was terrible, and it was magnificent, and it was uniquely American, because only in America does the narrative of individual achievement carry enough power to make us forget about collective responsibility. Only in America do we celebrate the hustler who wins while ignoring the community that loses. Only in America can a man become rich destroying his own neighborhood and still be remembered as a hero by the people he destroyed. The deal Bumpy negotiated with the mafia in the 1950s outlived him by decades. The precedent it set, the recognition it forced, became the template for how black organized crime operated in northern cities for the next generation. When Frank Matthews built his drug network in the 60s and 70s, he built on foundations Bumpy had laid. When Nicky Barnes became the most notorious black drug dealer in New York, he walked through doors Bumpy had opened. The deal wasn't just about money or territory. It was about changing the rules of engagement, about forcing institutions to acknowledge that the game had changed, and they either adapted or got left behind. That's Bumpy's real legacy. Not the violence or the wealth, but the shift. The moment when a black criminal looked at white criminals and said, "We're equals now," and made them believe it. But legacy is complicated when it's built in blood and heroin, when the deal that brought you respect also brought addiction and death to your community, when the power you achieved for yourself came at the cost of powerlessness for people who looked like you. Bumpy Johnson forced the world to recognize his humanity and his capability, but in doing so, he participated in systems that denied humanity to others. He broke barriers while building new ones. He challenged oppression while creating his own version of it. He succeeded by every metric that capitalism offers while failing by every metric that community requires. And we're left trying to make sense of contradictions that don't resolve cleanly. Trying to honor the struggle without celebrating the methods, trying to understand the context without excusing the choices. In the end, the story of Bumpy Johnson isn't really about crime or drugs or even power. It's about what America does to people, how it sorts them into categories of deserving and undeserving, how it creates conditions where crime becomes one of the only paths to dignity, how it punishes people for being poor and then punishes them again for trying to escape poverty through any means available, how it builds systems that ensure certain people stay at the bottom and then calls them criminals when they refuse to stay there. Bumpy Johnson was a product of these systems. He didn't create poverty or racism or the illegal economies they generated. He just navigated them with more skill and ruthlessness than most. And that navigation took him from a cold apartment with empty cupboards to penthouses and Cadillacs and dinners with bosses, took him from nothing to everything, took him from hunger to power. The hungry family became a memory, a story Bumpy told to explain himself to people who hadn't lived through that kind of desperation. But memory has weight. That night, when there was nothing to eat and nowhere to turn, never really left him. It stayed in his bones. It informed every decision. It justified every crime. It whispered that survival required ruthlessness and that mercy was a luxury for people who'd never gone hungry. That 7-year-old boy sitting at an empty table, watching his mother cry, made choices that night about what kind of man he'd become. And 40 years later, the richest black man in New York was still that hungry child. Still fighting, still refusing to ever be that powerless again. Still willing to do anything, absolutely anything, to make sure he never had to watch someone he loved suffer from poverty that could have been prevented. 20 years after hunger, a lifetime of crime, an empire built and lost and rebuilt, respect demanded and received, power achieved and maintained through violence and intelligence and will, and at the end, a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant, a funeral attended by hundreds, a legacy that refuses easy interpretation, a story that America keeps telling itself because it's the story of America itself, of people ground down by systems and fighting back through any means available, of moral complexity that doesn't resolve into simple heroism or villainy, of the distance between hungry child and wealthy boss, which turns out to be both infinite and non-existent, because the child never really leaves, the hunger never fully fades, the memory of powerlessness drives everything that comes after, and the empire built to escape that powerlessness becomes its own kind of prison. Different walls, same trap. Bumpy Johnson went from hungry to powerful, from nothing to everything, from invisible to impossible to ignore. And the gap between those states was bridged by choices that destroyed as much as they built, by deals that brought recognition at the cost of integrity, by success measured in dollars that bought everything except peace. His family never went hungry again, but whole neighborhoods did. He became the richest black man in New York, but the cost was paid by people who never had the choice to opt out, and were left with a story that refuses to be either celebration or condemnation, that exists in the uncomfortable space where most real life exists, where people do terrible things for understandable reasons, where systems create conditions that make terrible things seem necessary, where the distance from poverty to power is shorter than we like to admit and requires crossing lines we pretend are uncrossable. The apartment is still there. The neighborhood has changed. The drug trade has evolved. The crime families have risen and fallen. But the fundamental equation remains. Poverty plus racism plus desperation equals the kind of environment where Bumpy Johnsons emerge, where hungry children make calculations about survival that lead them down paths society condemns but helped create, where the only successful escape from systemic oppression seems to require joining different systems of oppression, where the triumph of one man is enabled by the suffering of many, where 20 years transforms a starving boy into a powerful boss, and somehow both versions of the person are equally real, equally present, equally trapped by circumstances that were never really choices at all, just different versions of the same impossible situation, just American life, just the story we keep telling because we don't know how to tell a different one.